Corveil's journal, written in a smudged and messy scrawl. My first days on the island were interesting, to be sure. I still don't know what to make of this place. Every bone in my body tells me that this is wrong, that this school is nothing more than a ritzy facade. But I have no proof. Yet. I attended several classes with Keen to try and understand what they're selling here. But honestly, it didn't help much. They're teaching of things and people I've never heard of before. They speak of their art in great reverence. But other than Lucien's fire show, I've seen no proof of its existence. Keen has reluctantly tried to fill in many of the gaps for me, though I can't be sure which things are true and which things he says to make me look like an idiot in front of other people. Cynthia has kept her distance from me for the most part, which I don't blame her. I was rather cruel to her. But all this nonsense and fairy talk is getting ridiculous. They can't actually expect me to believe any of this without proof, can they? I've also kept an eye on Titus Bowman. I've tried to talk to him, but he's quiet. He keeps to himself and to corners and shadows. His head is always down or in a book. Howard has avoided me like the plague, which is fine by me. My episodes have lessened, at least for now. Other than a few nightmares or a glimpse of my ghost now and then, they've been scarce. I've been keeping a record of strange things I've noticed and seen throughout my time here. I don't know if anything will come of my investigation or not, but I still have plenty of questions to ask. For now, I will continue to attend lessons and keep both eyes open. Victor Corveil. Chapter 5. Corveil stared into the small mirror of his bathroom. The knuckles on his hand turned white as he gripped the small vanity, his undershirt draped over his shoulder. From the image held within the mirror, the ghost's pale eyes stared back at him out of his own. He heard a hushed voice whisper his name in his ear, barely audible. The last breaths of a dying creature trying to say something through its death throes. Despite his discomfort, despite every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, to hide, he didn't break eye contact. He was tired of being afraid. Tired of dreading what was around the corner, what was behind his eyelids. He blinked, and the hollow yellow glow faded away. He heaved deeply, struggling to regain his faculties, then painfully, slowly, began to apply the salve and ointments that he had been instructed to treat his wounds with regularly. The scars of his bruised, burnt, and torn body showed out starkly on his shirtless torso. He winced in pain as he applied a thick green substance to the stub of his right hand. "Quit being such a baby!" Keen yelled from the main room of his dorm. At first, he tried to prevent him from barging into his room, but Keen was persistent and seemed to derive a kind of sick pleasure from watching Corveil nursing his wounds in pain. Keen appeared in the mirror as he walked into the doorway of the bathroom. "You would have thought that you would have gotten used to the pain after all this time," he said. "I would have thought you'd stop annoying me by now. But here you are," Corveil retorted through gritted teeth as he massaged another concoction into a burn on his right shoulder. Keen laughed coldly. "Oh, but it's such fun! Devils know there's nothing else to do in this godforsaken place." Corveil reached out and shut the bathroom door in his face, then continued his painful morning routine. He heard the table outside creak as Keen sat down atop it. Though Keen often spoke of how boring Antumbra was, Corveil knew that he secretly enjoyed being here, and despite his objections and constant berating of Corveil, he was also sure that he appreciated having company. But Corveil just wished he would give him some more peace and quiet every once in a while. "All right," he said from behind the door. Perhaps I've taken it too far. Corveil stopped what he was doing and stared at the door in confused anticipation. It almost seemed like Keen was about to apologize, something he had never done before. I'm sorry. Corveil opened the door and stared at Keen, dumbfounded. What? He exclaimed. It's not fair of me to pick on someone as clearly fragile and demented as you, he said with a laugh. Corveil wound up his shirt as if to whip Keen with it. Keen quickly shot up and darted past him and out the door into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. I'll see you in Solomonic Studies, Keen shouted through the thick door as he ran down the hall. Corveil placed his head against the door and breathed deeply. How did I wind up getting stuck with the entitled prat of the school? He wondered to himself. Then he returned to the bathroom. Within the mirror, he saw himself, wearing a worn green long-sleeve shirt and pants under a tan combat vest. The helmet that sat atop his head was cracked and dented. He felt a bullet rip through his abdomen. He cried out in pain and fell to one knee in front of the vanity. It's not a bullet. It's just the pain, he told himself. The war is over. But he knew inside it would never be over. His vision flashed back and forth between the tile floor and muddy trench, oak vanity and sandbag wall. He squeezed his eyes, forcing his way through the pain. The voice whispering his name returned, slightly clearer and more forceful now, which surprised him. His visions and his ghost had never tried speaking to him like that before. It took several moments for his world to reorder itself and snap back into place. Then, with a deep breath, he stood back up. Despite dreading it, Corveil did see Keen once again in Solomonic Studies, a class in which Cynthia and Titus were also in attendance. The professor teaching was a small, wiry man with thin spectacles and a receding hairline. He talked in a nasally voice, one that Corveil found even more annoying than Howard's, if such a thing could be possible. Everyone find a seat, the professor said. Corveil sat near the back of the room next to Keen, a few chairs over from where Titus was waiting. Cynthia, after sharply glancing towards Corveil, sat at the front, as far away from him as she possibly could be. He did feel bad for the way he had treated her, especially since nearly everyone here was just as delusional as she was, and Keen was far more annoying. He supposed he would have to find a way to apologize. The class itself proved fairly boring. The professor talked in great length and detail about demons and magic that supposedly the Israelite King Solomon had used throughout his reign and even to build his famous temple. It was a dry, long-winded, and esoteric account of historical events that were clearly made up. He glanced at Keen, seeing the all-too-familiar bored expression on their face, though he was surprised to see his lips moving, quoting the very thing the professor was saying at that time from memory. Towards the end of the lecture, the professor drew a number of strange symbols and shapes on a large dark green chalkboard, one of which, the Shield of David, Corveil recognized. You will see such symbols again in nearly every aspect of our art. They are one of the cornerstones of the systems of which we harness. Can anyone tell me what this symbol is? The professor asked, pointing to the six-pointed star. Corveil hesitantly raised his hand. That's the Shield of David. The professor chuckled. Yes, I suppose it is. But can anyone tell me what this shape itself is? Cynthia's hand shot up, obviously not wanting to be outdone by Corveil. A hexagram, she said confidently. Exactly. And can anyone tell me what the hexagram symbolizes? No one raised their hand. Anyone? The professor's scanning gaze landed on Keen. Mr. Serpin, perhaps you can enlighten us? Keen closed his eyes and breathed sharply out of his nose. It's one of the forms of power. It symbolizes the intersection of wisdom and knowledge, and holds the secondary consonants of the artist's tongue. Many think it to be the strongest of the esoteric shapes. He recited as if from a textbook. Very good, Keen. I'm sure many of you have various historical accounts of our art in your other classes and in other fields of study. I, however, have always found such things boring. Henceforth, we will be moving into the practical knowledge of our art. Keen, Cynthia, and Corveil all shifted forward in their seats, surprised by the shift in their curriculum. You have no doubt heard the wonders of our art, but you have yet to taste it for yourself. Practical lessons aren't supposed to start for first years for another few weeks, but I have been given permission to accelerate that timeline for this particular class. Keen sighed deeply. Did my father put you up to this? He asked coldly. The professor returned his hard stare. Despite his small stature, as Corveil looked at him now, he could sense a strength in him that he had not seen before. Who gave me permission is of little importance, but if you would rather study esoteric history in greater detail for the next few weeks instead, that can be arranged, Mr. Serpin. The professor turned to a small cabinet and withdrew a metal tray holding a number of signet rings of various materials. Our art comprises various esoteric philosophies and studies. The artist's tongue is an evolution of Kabbalah and the Enochian language. The summoning practices themselves are a combination of Enochian and Solomonic techniques in line with Hermetic practices. However, the instruments of our art, the tools from which we shape and create, have been passed down by Solomonic practitioners for millennia. The seal. These seals are powerful devices fueled by your very soul. He set the tray of rings down on his desk. A seal is crafted by its magus to enhance and extend their reach into the spiritual world. A seal is permanently bound to its crafter. It will not respond to anyone else without express permission until the crafter dies. Then the seal can be bound to another. But without being bound, it can be used to a lesser degree by any who know the arts. These are some such seals. Unbound. The professor lifted a silver ring off of the table and held it up. It was a small ring with an ornate golden sigil, but light glinted off of its edges. In the coming weeks, you will learn the artist's tongue and be able to call forth power from the spiritual realm through these seals. But perhaps we should have a demonstration. Mr. Serpin, if you would be so kind. Keen grunted audibly while rolling his large, dark eyes. He pulled his feet down from where they had been resting on the table with a slap, then got up and slowly walked to the front of the room. He was handed the ring as he approached. I believe fire and body with that ring should produce a result effective for this class, the professor said quietly to Keen. He began to place the ring on his left hand before the professor quickly lurched forward to stop him. Let's place it on the right-hand side for now, shall we? He said. Keen simply rolled his eyes again, which seemed to be his favorite expression, then placed the ring on the slender ring finger of his right hand. He held up his hand, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply before whispering in a harsh, low voice. The ring began to glow faintly. Gavia-ish, he said, and his hand immediately erupted in fire, engulfing it from the tip of his finger to the joint of his wrist. The class gasped in unison. It wasn't nearly as impressive as what Lucien had done days before, but it still was not something you would see every day. Corveil stared at the hand in stunned silence. Keen closed their hand, which extinguished the flames, quickly removed the ring, and returned to the seat next to Corveil.
Very well done, Keen. What Keen just did was a combination of the forces of fire and body, combined to create what you saw before you. Each ring is bound with certain spells and incantations that are specific to the crafter. Through trial and error, we have discovered which spells are bound to these seals, and we will be teaching you their incantations over the coming weeks. But that will be all for today. I hope it was enough to whet your appetite.
With that, he dismissed the gathered students and began to prepare for his next class. Corveil had to run to catch up to Keen as he exited the classroom.
How did you do that?
He asked. Body and fire. Despite him being a blundering idiot, I thought the professor actually did a decent job at explaining it, even for someone as dumb as you to understand, he said, walking still briskly. Corveil gave up trying to keep up with him and slowed to a walk. A flash of orange in the corner of his eye caught his attention, and he turned to see Cynthia exiting the class behind them, a large stack of books balancing precariously in her arms.
I'll catch up,
he shouted to Keen.
Unfortunately, you always do,
he replied with a slight smirk. Corveil walked towards Cynthia. Having seen him, she turned the other way.
Cynthia,
he called out to her. He saw her stop in place and heave her shoulders in frustration, but she didn't turn around to face him, forcing him to jog ahead of her where an icy stare awaited him.
What do you want, Corveil?
She asked shortly, shifting the massive stack of books awkwardly.
He stuttered under her intense gaze. I just wanted to apologize. I shouldn't have poked fun at your beliefs. It was a horrid thing for me to do, and I'm sorry.
Yes, it was, she said with a sniff. Why are you bothering me? I thought you found yourself a new friend.
Corveil chuckled.
I'd hardly call his lordship Keen a friend.
This provoked a slight curl of Cynthia's lips.
Lucien asked him to tutor me and show me the ropes.
She breathed in deeply.
I suppose I can accept your apology, but you owe me Victor Corveil.
He sighed.
All right, deal.
He reached out his left hand to shake. She glanced down on it, then shifted the books she was carrying to her right side and shook his hand.
Now help me carry these books.
Really? You're gonna waste your favor on making the one-armed guy carry your books for you?
He said. She turned bright red, remembering their first encounter. Unbeknownst to her, self-deprecation was not as triggering to him as when other people did it. He smiled broadly, causing him a mild amount of pain, but also causing her to turn her head in embarrassment and annoyance.
Yes, I am, she said, dumping the books into his arms. Plus, you're only missing a hand. You have two perfectly good arms.
Then she stormed off, and Corveil followed her. He carried her books, which were exceedingly heavy even for him, all the way back to her dormitory building, Jagger's Nest, since they had a while before the next class. Jagger's dormitory was similar to Rook's lair on the outside, but the interior was far simpler and more cozy. There was no tile, but instead deeply stained hardwood floors from large oak planks, covered in rugs and runners of various colors and materials. It created a look of some form of patchwork tapestry. The chandeliers were replaced with dull gas lamps and electric wall sconces for a slightly darker and less regal feeling. There were shelves everywhere. Some were full of books, while others were filled with strange artifacts and items of a huge variety. There were strange orbs and beakers and bones and weapons. It looked like a mixture of a dusty old library and a grand museum of ancient artifacts. He followed Cynthia to a large common room that held a massive stone fireplace on one side and a long table spanning the center of the room. Many non-uniform chairs and couches dotted the walls where several students sat studying. Rookslayer didn't have a common room like this for some reason, which was fine by Corveil. He preferred to be alone most of the time. He sat her books down on the long table and looked into the blazing hearth. Two eyes stared back out at him through the flames, hungry. He ignored them and turned back to Cynthia. "How are your studies going?" she asked, plopping down into a red velvet upholstered chair with a high back. "Oh, I'm not studying," he said, though he thought afterwards that perhaps it would be better for her and others to believe him as just another student. "So you're a slacker," she said, disgusted. "No," he corrected, now already committed to telling her the truth. "Clearly, I don't believe in the magical side of what's going on here. So Lucien has challenged me to investigate the academy and see what I can discover. He kind of gave me the run of the place." Her jaw dropped. "So you can go to any classes you want?" she exclaimed. "Even the higher level ones?" "Yeah, he asked Keen to help me, and they suggested that I take the entry-level classes first to get a baseline understanding of what's going on." She sat back in her chair, pouting. "I wish I could just go to any class I wanted." Corveil picked up one of her books and leafed through it. Due to his unique position, he wasn't required to actually do any homework or study for testing, so he hadn't actually looked at any of the textbooks yet. Keen claimed he didn't need them, and Corveil was inclined to believe him. This one was filled with geometric shapes like the ones he had seen in class, and text that he could barely understand. "Perhaps it wouldn't hurt to actually study some," he thought to himself. He reached to turn the page with his right hand, forgetting its absence, and awkwardly rubbed and folded it over with his stub. "Do you want to talk about it?" Cynthia asked, leaning forward. "Talk about what?" Corveil looked up from the book to meet her piercing green eyes. "The war." The word hit Corveil like a bomb's blast. He felt the concussion reverberate through his bones and in his chest. His vision started to blur, and the world shook. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing down the shuddering ghost rising up from within him. He breathed deeply and reopened his eyes, staring at her coldly from beneath his brow. "What in hell would make you think I want to talk about the war?" He slammed the book down against the thick oak table. Cynthia flinched away. Her eyes fell and her voice took on a much sadder and darker tone than he had heard from her before. "Because I want to talk about it. My brother fought too. He didn't make it." A wave of realization washed over Corveil. He had assumed that she, like everyone else he had encountered since the war, simply pitied him and treated him like a wounded animal. But maybe there was more. Maybe she wasn't as ignorant to the horrors of this world as he had originally thought. Though the looks she gave him were still sad, they were a deeper sadness, one rooted in her own pain, not just his. Anytime she saw his wounds, it probably reminded her of what she had lost. Yes, he had endured more suffering and pain than this girl probably ever had, but his pain didn't discount her own. Loss is loss. "I'm sorry," he managed to get out. "It's all right. It was harder at first, but it was what he wanted to do. Well, not die, of course, but he wanted to serve, to fight for our land. I can't hate him for that. But you didn't want to fight, did you?" "No." A soft, caring smile came to her lips. Surprisingly, he didn't find it patronizing. The way she smiled and laughed without a care in the world felt different now. It felt deeper than the innocence he had attributed to her before.
Tell me, please. It helps, she said sincerely.
Corveil drew in a deep breath, and the ghost screamed at him from every direction, a terrible wailing call. He couldn't tell if it was laughing or crying, maybe both, but the sound chilled his bones. He ignored the blood-curdling cries and opened his eyes.
I was drafted right after I turned 18, bussed off to a training camp. I was only there for a week before they shipped me off with the graduates. I tried to tell them that I had just gotten there. They just called me a coward.
The memories caused his scars to burn. He felt his stomach sink as the officer told him that he was to be deployed.
When I first landed on the continent, it was hell. Boots like me weren't supposed to see combat yet. We're supposed to be set guarding outposts or running patrols far from the enemy. I got sent straight to the front lines, as if God himself was trying to kill me.
He remembered the long march to the front vividly, dreading every second as if it were his last.
Everything after that is a blur. I don't really know how long I was there, how many battles I fought. I saw my brothers die beside me. I saw the Huns die by my own hands. I feel like I got wounded in every way possible. Bullets, knives, bombs, gas, rubble. It felt like I had died 1,000 times. More. But I guess I hadn't suffered enough yet.
The last day that he remembered surged into his mind, into his chest. He felt the pressure build up, causing physical pain inside of him. His ghost squeezing his heart between its impossibly long and impossibly gaunt hands. I was crawling through the mud. A howitzer shell buried itself a few feet away from me. Then it all went dark. I didn't wake up again until I was back in the States months later, missing a hand and half of my face. I've been on my own ever since. Cynthia's face was a mask of pain, her eyes at the brink of tears.
What about your family? Your parents?
I don't want to talk about my parents.
Truthfully, he didn't even want to think about his parents. At first, he had assumed that they thought he was dead. That was why they never visited him in the hospital. The truth, however, was much more painful. Corveil felt the ghost retreat for now as he calmed himself down. A coolness washed over him, and he closed his eyes and breathed.
Are you all right?
She asked him.
Yeah, I think so.
Excuse me, a voice called out from behind him. He turned to see a tall woman wearing a plain pleated black dress enter the room. This is an all-female dormitory. Males are not allowed, she said, slightly annoyed.
I am so sorry, Miss Jagger. He was just here helping me carry my books,
Cynthia said, rising from her chair.
All the same, I'll have to ask you to leave.
Of course, my apologies,
Corveil responded, rising himself and heading towards the door. Cynthia's hand reached out and caught his right forearm. He turned to look at her.
Thank you, Victor.
He nodded solemnly back, trying his best to smile.
I'll see you later, Cynthia,
he said, then walked out of the dormitory alone.